Hi, I'm Professor John Scott. I work at the Queensland University of Technology in Australia in the School of Justice. I'm a sociologist, criminologist. This is my book, Male Sex Work in Society. This book came out in 2014. It's co-edited with myself and Professor Victor Minichiello, who is affiliated with several Australian universities, including Queensland University of Technology. This book has roughly 17 chapters, and its contributors come from a range of different countries and institutions. Well, as the title suggests, it's about male sex work, and I guess in terms of topics, some of the areas that we were interested in this book was really just to introduce readers to male sex work, because when you think about sex work, you typically think about female sex work. So people think about sex work as they're thinking about women, typically, not men. So the fact that men engage in sex work and always have was something that we wanted to familiarise our audience with. Feminists are interested in sex work from the point of view that it's associated with power, male power. So it's often pointed out that in terms of supply, it's female with sex work, and demand, it's male. Now, male sex work sort of throws that out of kilter, and it's quite different. So if you look at male sex work, the supply is typically male and the demand is typically male. Is there still a power relationship involved? Well, I would like to say yes, but it's probably a little bit different. So it's not just one based on gender. Often when we look at female sex work, gender is the main area, the main variable that researchers are concerned with. But when you look at male sex work, the main variable tends to be associated with sexuality. So in the past, it's often been said that the sex workers, well, in the early studies, sex workers were typically portrayed as being heterosexual, but in more recent studies, they tend to be portrayed as being bisexual or gay in the majority. In the early studies, the clients were typically portrayed as being gay, but in more recent studies, they're portrayed as being straight. So there's been a bit of a shift in how they're conceived. That may be a result of the research, but it may also be just changing, social norms. So there's a major debate about how should we regulate female sex work. Should it be regulated at all? Should it be legalised? Should it be criminalised? What's the best way to control, regulate this industry? And there's two different feminist camps around that. So, you've often got your radical feminists. They can be called a number of different names, but I'll use the term radical, who tend to say, well, look, we should be criminalising it, and sex work, or prostitution as they call it, reflects inequality in society that's very much entrenched, in male power, patriarchy. Whereas you've got liberal feminists who take a very different point of view, and they say, well, look, it's highly problematic. Sex work is a problem in society. However, if we try to criminalise it, the people who typically suffer are the women themselves who are working in the industry. We don't penalise the clients, who are typically the men. So that's a major issue there when we look at sex work in a broad, sort of based way. If we look at it in terms of men, the same issues apply. Should it be legalised? Should it be criminalised? Most sex workers, when we talk to sex workers, say that they favour decriminalisation, which is a little bit different from legalisation. So when we talk about decriminalisation, it means that the state isn't involved. It's not criminal, it's not regulated by the state. It can be subject to some forms of regulation. In Australia and New Zealand, where it's decriminalised, it may be subject to local government regulations. There may be still some form of regulation about the age of people who are involved in the sex industry. So it's not a sort of laissez-faire approach. It doesn't mean it's fully liberal, the way that we treat it, but it means that the state isn't involved in, say, licensing the sex industry or sex workers, which is what often happens in other parts of the world. Well, in the United States, each state treats sex work differently. Typically, there tends to be a lot of criminal sanctions around it. The one state that's probably unique in the US is Nevada, where people will be aware that it is legalised in some forms. In Australia, as I mentioned before, there tends to be, state-based again, the regulation. There's a lot of variability around the regulation. In New South Wales, it's really interesting because it's decriminalised in New South Wales and has been since 1995. And people who favour decriminalisation, including sex workers themselves, argue that as a result of decriminalisation in New South Wales, the health of sex workers and their clients has actually improved. It's got better. And also that it goes against corruption, so where prostitution is criminalised, you often get police-state corruption around the sex industry. Not all brothels get policed quite clearly. Some do, some don't. We're looking down the path. There were issues of corruption in Australia, as there are in the US around the sex industry. So decriminalisation, it's argued, can avoid that. So you get less arrests. There's less costs on the state, and some people would argue, this is an industry involving consenting, rational adults who are freely choosing what they want to choose. Women are agents, men are agents. They go out and they engage in something contractual between each other, and the state shouldn't be involved in that. Why should the state be involved in that sort of activity? If the state is involved in activity, and if they're locking people away, well, many people argue it's typically women that get locked away and get punished where it's criminalised. And of course, if you're a taxpayer, that all costs dollars. You put somebody in jail and it costs money. I don't know about the States, but in Australia it costs about $250 a day to keep somebody in a prison. Is that value for money, especially when they're not dangerous? Should we be locking away people that aren't even dangerous? People who are simply engaging in sexual relations? Is that smart? Is that how you want your criminal justice system? So when we look at male sex work, most of it's online. So it doesn't actually occur in brothels even. It is online, sort of independent operators who are going out there and getting involved. Some recent research Victor and I have done with our colleague Denton Callender at the University of New South Wales, we looked at numbers of male sex workers globally, and we sort of added up the numbers of escorts online in various places, and we looked at who they were marketing to. And interestingly enough, there were some of the biggest countries, of course, was America. There's just a lot of internet in America. But they weren't the only places where male sex work was big. Male sex work exists in quite large numbers in China, in South America. And in South America, a lot of countries, the online escorts at least, tend to cater largely to females and couples. So that's surprising when we think of some of the gender stereotypes. You think of machismo in a Latin American context. You don't think of these men actually marketing specifically for women. The same goes for China. So there's that stereotype of East Asian women as being demure and meek and so on, and you wouldn't think of them going out to these clubs and that and hiring male sex workers, but it's certainly happening. So I think that's interesting at the moment. That's exciting. There's a lot of sex tourism in the world, and women are involved in sex tourism, so going to the Caribbean, going to Africa, these different locations, and that tends to be the sex tourists, just like the men who are sex tourists. The women tend to be white, fairly wealthy, educated women from Western democracies, such as America and Australia and Britain, and they're going out to these locations around the world, and they're hiring males, often as for what's sometimes termed a boyfriend experience. Which means a more intimate type of experience with a sex worker rather than just purely a sexual experience for a very limited amount of time, such as an hour or 2 hours or whatever. So look, there was an over-focus on sex workers in the past, on street workers in particular. Clients tended to be a little bit invisible, because clients are also stigmatised to some extent. So it's an interesting thing. Clients may not get criminalised, may not get penalised, but they are stigmatised to some extent. And of course they don't want to be identified. Okay, a lot of them are married, so there's probably good reason why they don't want to be identified. And even when you look at male sex work, the same thing applies. A lot of them present as straight men who are married, and they don't want to be publicly out there. So it's often hard to get interviews with clients. It's often hard to talk to them as a social researcher, and even harder when they're involved in male sex workers clients, because they're doubly stigmatised, not only as being a client, but as being a client of same-sex relations, paying for same-sex relations. So there's a double stigma associated with it. We've got a second volume of Male Sex Work and Society coming out. So our editor, Bill Cohen, in New York with Harrington Park Press, which specialises in literature around sexualities, queer, diverse sexualities, was so pleased with the success of the first volume that he has now commissioned a second volume of Male Sex Work and Society, which will come out next year, late next year. We've started that process. We're recruiting authors at the moment, so we expect to have about anywhere between 15 and 20 new chapters for that book. For that book, we're going to broaden a little bit more, and we're also going to bring in some authors who are working directly in the industry, which was something that we didn't do in the first volume, but we want to do in this volume.